I discovered the bright orange citation fluttering against my garage door on a Tuesday morning in February, held in place by a strip of duct tape that left sticky residue on the paint. The fine was $250, and the infraction listed made my blood boil. Visible storage of seasonal recreational equipment in violation of Community Standards Article 7, Section 3. My snowboard and skis were leaning against the inside wall of my garage, visible only when the door was open, which it had been for maybe 20 minutes the previous afternoon while I reorganized some boxes. I lived in Pine Ridge Estates, a planned community just outside Boulder, Colorado, where the Homeowners Association had apparently decided that even a glimpse of winter sports equipment was an aesthetic crime worthy of a hefty fine. I stood there in my driveway, still wearing my pajama pants and holding my coffee mug, reading the citation 3 times to make sure I was not hallucinating. The signature at the bottom belonged to Patricia Moreland, the HOA president, whose name I had come to associate with countless petty complaints over the 2 years I had lived here. The woman had the uncanny ability to materialize whenever anyone so much as left their trash can out 15 minutes past the designated collection time. My name is Ethan Parker, and I am a 32-year-old software developer who works from home. I bought this house because it was close to the mountains, affordable, and seemed like a quiet place to settle down. What I had not anticipated was that Pine Ridge Estates operated less like a neighborhood and more like a totalitarian micronation, where Patricia and her board of enforcers dictated everything from mailbox colors to the precise height of lawn grass. I went inside and immediately pulled up the HOA bylaws on my laptop. Article 7, Section 3 did indeed mention seasonal equipment, but the language was vague enough to be interpreted a dozen different ways. It talked about exterior storage and visible placement from common areas or streets. My garage was neither exterior nor visible from the street when the door was closed. I had photographic evidence on my phone showing that the door had only been open briefly, and even then, you would have needed to stand directly in my driveway to see inside. This was going to be a fight, and I was not about to pay $250 for Patricia's overreach. I called the HOA office number listed on the citation. A cheerful recorded message informed me that office hours were Monday through Friday, 9 to 3, and that I could leave a message. I did, keeping my tone professional but firm, explaining that I disputed the fine and requested a hearing with the board. 3 days passed with no response. I sent an email to the general HOA address. Nothing. Finally, on Friday afternoon, my phone rang from an unknown local number. Mr. Parker, this is Patricia Moreland from the Pine Ridge Estates HOA board. Her voice had the quality of someone perpetually sucking on a lemon. I received your message about the citation. Yes, thank you for calling back. I want to formally dispute this fine. My equipment was inside my garage, not in exterior storage. Your garage door was open, making the items visible from the common walkway. That constitutes a violation. For 20 minutes while I was reorganizing, the bylaws specify exterior storage, which this was not. Patricia made a sound somewhere between a sigh and a scoff. Mr. Parker, the spirit of the rule is to maintain our community's visual standards. Clutter of any kind reflects poorly on property values. A snowboard and skis during winter in Colorado are not clutter. They are normal seasonal items that I use regularly. Be that as it may, the citation stands. You can appeal to the board at our next meeting on March 1st, but I will tell you now that we take these matters seriously. If you choose not to pay, additional late fees will accrue at $50 per week. I felt my jaw clench. "I will be at that meeting. Please submit your appeal in writing at least 1 week prior." "Good day, Mr. Parker." She hung up before I could respond. I sat there staring at my phone, contemplating whether moving to a neighborhood with an HOA had been the worst decision of my adult life. The answer was increasingly looking like yes. Over the next week, I drafted my written appeal, citing specific language from the bylaws and including time-stamped photos proving my garage door had been closed except for that brief period. I also started documenting everything I could find around Pine Ridge Estates that seemed to violate the same strict interpretation Patricia was applying to my situation. If she wanted to play hardball about visual standards, I was going to make sure the playing field was level. What I discovered during my walks around the neighborhood was enlightening. The community had numerous utility boxes scattered throughout, painted a hideous shade of beige that matched nothing and stood out against the landscaping like architectural warts. These boxes housed electrical equipment, internet infrastructure, and other utilities. They were necessary but ugly, and they were everywhere. Some had graffiti. Others had weeds growing around their bases. A few were positioned in locations that blocked sightlines or created awkward dead spaces in otherwise pleasant areas. The irony was not lost on me. Patricia wanted to fine me for winter gear visible inside my garage for minutes, yet these permanent eyesores stood as unmaintained monuments to poor planning. I took extensive photos, noting locations and conditions. March 1st arrived with typical Colorado weather, sunny but cold. The HOA meeting was held in the community clubhouse, a building I had been inside exactly once before for a mandatory new homeowner orientation. About 15 people were scattered in the folding chairs when I arrived, most of them board members or regular attendees who seemed to thrive on this sort of bureaucratic theater. Patricia sat at the head of a long table with 4 other board members, 3 women and 1 elderly man who looked like he would rather be anywhere else. She wore a cream-colored blazer and had her hair pulled back so tightly I wondered if it was causing a headache. When she saw me enter, her expression shifted into something approximating a smile, but it never reached her eyes. "Good evening, everyone. Let us call this meeting to order." Patricia rapped a gavel against the table with unnecessary force. The meeting began with standard business: approval of previous minutes, treasurer's report, discussion of landscaping bids. I sat through 45 minutes of minutiae before my appeal finally appeared on the agenda. Next, we have an appeal from Mr. Ethan Parker regarding citation number 2047. Mr. Parker, you have 5 minutes to present your case. I stood and walked to the front, handing out copies of my written statement to each board member. "Thank you." As outlined in my appeal, I believe this citation was issued in error. The bylaws specify that exterior storage of seasonal equipment is prohibited. My items were inside my garage. The door was temporarily open for approximately 20 minutes while I was reorganizing, and the equipment was not visible from the street or common areas except from directly within my private driveway. One of the other board members, a woman named Susan, raised her hand. But if the garage door was open, wasn't it technically visible? Only if someone walked onto my property. The bylaw addresses exterior storage and visibility from common areas to prevent permanent outdoor clutter. A temporary glimpse inside someone's garage during normal use does not meet that standard. Or else every time anyone opened their garage door, they would risk citation for whatever is stored inside. Patricia leaned forward. "Mr. Parker, the board's interpretation is that any visibility of prohibited items constitutes a violation. We cannot make exceptions based on duration or intent, as that would be impossible to enforce consistently. Then, I would argue the rule itself is unreasonable and possibly unenforceable. Additionally, if we are discussing visibility and aesthetic standards, I would like to address the condition of the utility boxes throughout our community. I pulled out my folder of photographs and distributed them. Patricia's expression darkened immediately. Those are not within the HOA's jurisdiction. They are maintained by utility companies and the county. But they affect our community's visual standards far more than my snowboard ever could. Some have graffiti. Many are poorly maintained. If the board is going to fine residents for minor, temporary visibility issues, it seems inconsistent not to address these permanent eyesores. The elderly board member, whose nameplate read Gerald, actually chuckled. The young man has a point, Patricia. Her glare could have frozen water. That is not relevant to this appeal. The board will take your statement under advisement, Mr. Parker. We will vote and notify you of our decision within 5 business days. I returned to my seat, knowing full well how this would go. Sure enough, 4 days later, I received a letter informing me that my appeal had been denied by a vote of 4-1, with Gerald apparently being my lone supporter. The fine remained, now with an additional $50 in late fees since I had not paid within the initial 30-day window. $300 for winter gear that lived inside my garage. I was furious, but more than that, I was determined not to let Patricia win through sheer bureaucratic bullying. I paid the fine under protest, documenting everything for potential future legal action, and then I started thinking strategically. The utility boxes had given me an idea. If Patricia wanted to enforce absurd standards about visibility, I would comply in the most technically correct but malicious way possible. My winter gear would no longer be visible from anywhere on my property. Instead, I would store it behind the utility boxes scattered around Pine Ridge Estates. The plan was simple, but required careful execution. The utility boxes were on common property, maintained by external entities, and therefore outside the HOA's direct jurisdiction according to Patricia's own statement. If my equipment was stored behind them, it would not be on my property and thus could not violate rules about exterior storage at my residence. It would also be less visible than if I left it in my garage, tucked away behind these beige monstrosities. I started with the box closest to my house, located about 50 yards down the sidewalk near a small retention pond. It was roughly 4 feet tall and 3 feet wide, providing adequate coverage for a snowboard if I positioned it correctly. On a Sunday morning when the neighborhood was quiet, I walked down with my snowboard under my arm and carefully placed it behind the box, ensuring it was not blocking any access panels or ventilation. The skis went behind a different box near the community mailboxes, an area with heavy foot traffic, but where the box created a blind spot from most angles. I used bungee cords to secure them so they would not fall over or blow away in the wind. Standing back to admire my handiwork, I felt a profound sense of petty satisfaction. My winter gear was now completely invisible from my property, stored in common areas that the HOA claimed they could not control. Technically, I was not violating any storage rules. I was just a concerned resident making use of available space to keep equipment out of sight. For 3 glorious days, nothing happened. I went about my work, occasionally checking on my stashed equipment to make sure it remained undisturbed. The snowboard was fine, tucked neatly behind the utility box. The skis were secure near the mailboxes. Then Patricia discovered them. I was on a video call with a client when my doorbell rang insistently. the kind of aggressive ringing that suggested whoever was pressing it had no intention of being ignored. I excused myself from the meeting and went to the door, already knowing who I would find. Patricia stood on my porch, her face flushed with anger. Behind her was another board member, a woman named Carol who always seemed to follow Patricia around like a devoted henchman. "Mr. Parker, what is the meaning of this?" Patricia held up her phone, showing a photo of my snowboard behind the utility box. "The meaning of what? Do not play games with me. You have stored your equipment behind community utility boxes. This is completely unacceptable." I leaned against the doorframe, keeping my expression neutral. "I apologize, but I do not see the problem. You cited me for visible storage on my property. This equipment is not on my property. It is in common areas, behind utility infrastructure that you yourself stated was outside the HOA's jurisdiction. You cannot just leave your belongings scattered around the neighborhood." "I have not scattered anything. I have carefully placed my seasonal equipment in discrete locations where it is not visible and does not interfere with anyone's use of common spaces. I am complying with your interpretation of the storage rules." Carol stepped forward. "This is vandalism. We could call the police." "Vandalism requires damage or defacement of property. I have not damaged anything. My equipment is simply stored temporarily behind existing structures." Patricia's nostrils flared. "You will remove these items immediately, or I will have them removed and charge you for disposal." "On what grounds? The utility boxes are not HOA property. The land around them is either county-maintained easement or common area. I am not violating any written rule by placing personal items in common areas, especially when the HOA's own interpretation forced me to remove them from my private property." "This is absurd." "I agree completely. This entire situation is absurd. I was fined $300 for winter gear that was inside my garage. I am now storing that gear exactly as you demanded, out of sight and off my property. If you have a specific bylaw that prohibits residents from placing items in common areas, please cite it. Otherwise, I am in full compliance." Patricia looked like she wanted to explode. Her hands were shaking slightly, whether from anger or frustration I could not tell. Carol whispered something to her, and Patricia took a visible breath to compose herself. "The board will be addressing this at our next meeting. In the meantime, consider this a verbal warning. If I find any more of your property in inappropriate locations, there will be consequences." "I look forward to the meeting," I said pleasantly. They left, Patricia's heels clicking angrily against the walkway. I closed the door and allowed myself a brief smile. This was going to get interesting. Over the next week, I noticed increased activity from Patricia and her enforcers. They walked the neighborhood more frequently, clipboards in hand, documenting everything with the dedication of Cold War spies. I received 2 more citations, one for my trash can being visible from the street for 3 hours after collection time, despite the bylaws allowing until 6 p.m. The other was for a non-approved door wreath that I did not actually have. When I called to point out the error, I was told they would review the matter, which apparently meant ignoring it entirely. The retaliation was obvious, but I had expected it. Patricia was not the type to accept being outmaneuvered, especially not publicly. What I had not anticipated was how far she would go. The board scheduled an emergency meeting specifically to address what Patricia termed misuse of common areas and deliberate violation of community standards. The meeting notice was posted on the community website and delivered to every residence, painting me as a troublemaker who was undermining the HOA's authority. I showed up to find the clubhouse more crowded than before. Apparently, Drama was excellent for attendance. Patricia had clearly been campaigning, because several residents I had never spoken with gave me unfriendly looks when I entered. The meeting began with Patricia outlining the situation. She presented photos of my snowboard and skis behind the utility boxes, describing it as willful disregard for community harmony and a deliberate attempt to create loopholes in our carefully constructed bylaws. When it was my turn to speak, I kept my tone measured. I appreciate the board's concern for community standards. However, I followed the exact interpretation that President Moreland provided when she issued my original citation. She stated that any visibility of seasonal equipment from my property was prohibited. I complied by moving the equipment to locations where it is not on my property and is less visible than it would be inside my garage. If the board wants to create a new rule about common area storage, that is their prerogative, but it cannot be applied retroactively to actions taken in good faith compliance with existing rules. An older gentleman I recognized from a few houses down raised his hand. I have a question for the board. Why are we spending time on this when there are actual problems in the community? The streetlight near my house has been out for 6 weeks, and I have submitted 3 maintenance requests that have gone ignored. Patricia looked flustered. That is being addressed, Mr. Henderson. Is it? Because I am still walking home in the dark every night. Meanwhile, we are holding emergency meetings about a snowboard behind a utility box. Murmurs of agreement rippled through the audience. I had not expected support from other residents, but apparently, Patricia's aggressive enforcement had created more dissatisfaction than I realized. Susan, one of the board members, spoke up. Perhaps we should table this discussion and focus on more pressing maintenance issues. I agree that this seems like a matter that could be resolved with a simple conversation rather than formal proceedings. Patricia's jaw tightened. The board must maintain authority and consistency. If we allow residents to flagrantly disregard our standards, where does it end? With all due respect, Patricia, we are talking about ski equipment in Colorado during winter. This is not exactly a crime wave. This came from Gerald, the elderly board member who had voted in my favor before. The meeting devolved into argument, with residents bringing up various grievances about HOA enforcement priorities, maintenance delays, and what several people termed Patricia's overzealous interpretation of bylaws. I sat quietly, watching as the coalition I had not known existed began to form. The meeting ended without any formal action, but Patricia shot me a look that promised this was far from over. As people filed out, several residents approached me to express support or share their own HOA horror stories. Mr. Henderson invited me to a neighborhood barbecue, mentioning that several homeowners had been discussing ways to push back against what they saw as the board's overreach. I drove home that night feeling like perhaps I was not alone in this fight after all. The next few weeks brought an unexpected development. Patricia began issuing citations at an alarming rate, not just to me but to numerous residents throughout Pine Ridge Estates. Mr. Henderson got fined for his mailbox being a 1/4 inch too short according to a measurement Patricia personally conducted. A young couple 3 streets over received a citation for excessive vehicle parking because they had 2 cars in their driveway simultaneously. An elderly widow was fined for her garden gnomes being non-conforming decorative elements. The community Facebook group, which I had mostly ignored until now, exploded with complaints. People who had never questioned the HOA before were suddenly sharing photos of citations and demanding explanations. Someone created a spreadsheet documenting all the fines issued in the past month, and the total exceeded $12,000 across 43 households. I received 3 more citations during this period. One for my doormat being red instead of an earth tone color, which was news to me since the bylaw about doormats had apparently been added in a recent board vote without proper notice to residents. Another for my car being parked too far from the curb by an amount that required precision measurement tools to detect. The third was for excessive noise, because I had been playing music in my backyard at 3 in the afternoon on a Saturday. Each fine was $250, the same amount as my original citation. I was now over $1,000 in disputed fines, and I was far from the only one. Mr. Henderson contacted me in early April with a proposal. A group of homeowners wanted to organize a petition to recall the HOA board and install new leadership. Under Colorado law and our community bylaws, this required signatures from at least 30% of homeowners, and then a vote. If successful, we could remove Patricia and her supporters and hopefully restore some sanity to Pine Ridge Estates. I agreed immediately and volunteered to help coordinate the effort. We formed a committee of 7 residents, including Mr. Henderson, myself, a lawyer named Deanna Thompson who lived near the community park, and 4 others who had been on the receiving end of Patricia's citation spree. Diana proved invaluable. She reviewed every citation issued in the past 6 months and found numerous procedural violations. Many fines had been issued without proper notice. Some cited bylaws that had never been officially adopted. Others applied rules inconsistently, fining some residents while ignoring identical situations elsewhere. Patricia had also been approving expenditures without board votes and had potentially misallocated HOA funds, though we would need access to financial records to prove that. We spent 2 weeks canvassing the neighborhood, explaining the recall process and gathering signatures. The response was overwhelming. People were angry, frustrated, and ready for change. Within 10 days, we had signatures from 68% of homeowners, more than double what we needed. Patricia's response was to issue a statement declaring the recall effort invalid and based on misinformation. She claimed that only board members could initiate recalls and that our petition had no legal standing. Deanna quickly debunked this, citing specific sections of Colorado HOA law and our community bylaws that explicitly allowed homeowner-initiated recalls. The county clerk's office confirmed that our petition met all legal requirements, and a recall vote was scheduled for May 15th. The next 6 weeks were intense. Patricia and her supporters launched a counter-campaign, sending letters to every household warning about the chaos that would result from removing the board. They claimed property values would plummet, maintenance would cease, and the community would descend into disorder without their steady leadership. Our side focused on facts. We documented the citation spree, the procedural violations, and the apparent financial irregularities. Deanna filed a formal request for HOA financial records, which Patricia initially refused before being forced to comply by a strongly worded letter from Diana's law firm. When we finally received the records, what we found was worse than expected. Patricia had been approving payments to her own landscaping company for work in common areas, a clear conflict of interest that had never been disclosed. She had also authorized a contract with her brother-in-law's property management firm at rates significantly above market value. Over the past 3 years, approximately $80,000 in HOA funds had been directed to companies owned by Patricia or her family members. This was not just overreach. This was fraud. Diana immediately advised that we needed to involve law enforcement. We compiled all the evidence, and submitted it to the Boulder County District Attorney's Office with a formal complaint. We also shared our findings with the homeowners, posting detailed documentation on the community website and social media. The recall vote was no longer about disagreements over enforcement. It was about removing someone who had been systematically embezzling from the community. Patricia went silent. No more citations were issued. She stopped attending community events and rarely left her house. Carol and the other board members distanced themselves, claiming they had no knowledge of Patricia's financial arrangements. Susan actually resigned from the board entirely, issuing a public statement apologizing for not providing adequate oversight. May 15th arrived with record turnout. 87% of eligible homeowners voted, and the results were decisive. The recall passed with 92% approval. Patricia and the remaining board members were removed immediately, and a temporary leadership committee was established to manage HOA operations until a new board could be elected. 2 weeks later, detectives from the Boulder County Sheriff's Office arrived at Patricia's house with a warrant. I watched from my window as she was led out in handcuffs, her face pale and expressionless. The local news covered the story that evening, describing it as one of the largest HOA fraud cases in county history. Patricia was charged with theft, embezzlement, fraud, and abuse of a fiduciary duty. Her landscaping company was also under investigation for potential tax violations. The legal proceedings took months, but the community began healing much faster. We held elections for a new board in June, and I found myself nominated along with Mr. Henderson, Deanna, and several other recall committee members. I was reluctant at first, having never wanted to be involved in HOA politics, but enough people convinced me that my perspective was needed to prevent future abuses. The new board's first action was to review and reform the bylaws. We eliminated vague language that had allowed selective enforcement. We established clear procedures for citations, including mandatory warnings before fines and a transparent appeal process. We also implemented strict conflict of interest policies and required multiple board members to approve any expenditure over $500. We refunded or forgave every citation issued during Patricia's final months as president, which totaled over $30,000 across dozens of households. My own fines were canceled, and I received a formal apology from the new board. In August, Patricia pleaded guilty to multiple felony counts in exchange for a reduced sentence. She was ordered to repay the full amount she had stolen, plus interest and penalties, and was sentenced to 3 years in state prison with the possibility of parole after 18 months. Her landscaping company folded, and her family quietly moved out of Pine Ridge Estates. Life in the neighborhood improved dramatically. The new board focused on genuine community needs rather than petty enforcement. Streetlights were repaired. Common areas received proper maintenance. We organized social events that actually brought people together rather than divide them with arbitrary rules. I kept my snowboard and skis in my garage where they belonged. The utility boxes remained, still ugly, but no longer symbols of my resistance against bureaucratic tyranny. Occasionally, I would walk past the one where I had hidden my snowboard and smile at the memory. Mr. Henderson and I became good friends. He was a retired civil engineer with countless stories about construction projects gone wrong, and we often shared beers on his patio while discussing neighborhood improvements. Deanna remained on the board and proved to be an exceptional treasurer, bringing transparency and professionalism to HOA finances. Together, we worked to transform Pine Ridge Estates from a place ruled by fear and petty regulations into an actual community. One evening in late September, almost 8 months after that first citation had appeared on my garage door, I was sitting on my back deck watching the sunset when my doorbell rang. I answered to find a woman about my age with dark hair and an apologetic smile. Her name was Nicole Torres, and she had just moved into Patricia's former house. "I hope I am not bothering you," she said. "I just wanted to introduce myself and thank you. I read about what happened here before I bought the house, and honestly, it was part of why I chose this neighborhood." The fact that residents stood up against corruption and actually made changes says a lot about this community. We talked for over an hour, and I learned that Nicole was a graphic designer who worked remotely, much like myself. She had moved from Denver seeking a quieter lifestyle and was already impressed by how welcoming everyone had been. Before she left, she mentioned wanting to get involved in community activities and asked if the HOA was looking for volunteers. I gave her Deanna's contact information and encouraged her to attend the next board meeting. As I watched her walk back to her house, the one that had been Patricia's until very recently, I felt a sense of closure. The entire ordeal had started with a petty fine over winter gear and escalated into uncovering systematic fraud. It had consumed nearly a year of my life, created stress and conflict I never wanted, but had ultimately resulted in something positive. Pine Ridge Estates was not perfect. We still had disputes over parking and noise, and all the small conflicts that arise when people live in close proximity. But we now had systems in place to address those issues fairly. We had leaders who actually served the community rather than exploiting it. And we had residents who knew that standing up against injustice, even over something as seemingly minor as a snowboard behind a utility box, could create meaningful change. The winter season arrived again in November, and I was back on the slopes every weekend. My gear lived openly in my garage, exactly where it should be. Sometimes the door was open for extended periods while I waxed boards or maintained equipment. Nobody complained. Nobody measured the visibility from various angles or consulted bylaws about seasonal storage. We held a community holiday party in December, the first one in years according to longtime residents. Over 100 people attended, filling the clubhouse with conversation and laughter. Mr. Henderson dressed as Santa and distributed small gifts to neighborhood children. Deanna organized a charity drive that collected donations for local families in need. Nicole designed beautiful invitations and decorations, already becoming an integral part of our community. I found myself talking with Gerald, the elderly board member who had supported me from the beginning. He was 83 years old and had lived in Pine Ridge Estate since it was first developed 20 years ago. "You know, son, I have seen a lot of changes here over the years," he said, holding a cup of punch. "Board members come and go. Rules get stricter, then looser, then stricter again. But what happened this year was different. You folks did not just complain. You organized. You followed the process. You made it about principles, not personalities. That is rare and it is valuable. I just did not want to pay $300 for keeping my snowboard in my garage," I said with a laugh. Maybe that is how it started, but it became about much more. Patricia was a symptom of a larger problem. HOAs are supposed to protect property values and maintain communities, but too often they attract people who crave petty authority. They start making rules just to make rules, enforcing standards that serve no real purpose except to demonstrate power. You reminded everyone that homeowners are not subjects. We are members of a community with rights and voices. His words stayed with me long after the party ended. The experience had taught me something important about civic engagement and the responsibility that comes with homeownership. It is easy to ignore problems, to pay unjust fines and grumble privately rather than take action. It is much harder to organize, to challenge authority, to risk conflict in pursuit of justice. But it matters. Small-scale local governance might seem trivial compared to national politics or global issues, but it directly affects daily life. An HOA board can make your home a sanctuary or a source of constant stress. The quality of your neighborhood, the relationships with people who live around you, the sense of belonging to a community rather than just residing in proximity to strangers, all of these things are shaped by how governance functions at the most local level. January arrived, marking 1 year since I had moved to Pine Ridge Estates and about 10 months since the citation that started everything. The new board was functioning smoothly. Finances were transparent and properly managed. Maintenance was handled efficiently. Disputes were resolved fairly. We had even started a neighborhood newsletter, edited by Nicole, that kept everyone informed about community activities and decisions. I was preparing for a ski trip one Saturday morning, loading equipment into my SUV with the garage door wide open. My snowboard was clearly visible from the street. My skis were propped against the wall. Winter gear was scattered around in organized chaos. A car slowed down as it passed my house, and for a brief moment, I felt that old anxiety. Then I recognized the driver as one of my neighbors, a retired teacher named Margaret who had been one of the first to sign our recall petition. She waved enthusiastically, and I waved back, smiling. That simple interaction crystallized everything. I was not afraid of my own HOA anymore. I was not constantly worried about citations or fines or arbitrary enforcement. I could live in my home, store my possessions where they made sense, and be part of a community that functioned on mutual respect rather than authoritarian control. The utility boxes were still there throughout the neighborhood, still ugly and beige and poorly maintained by their respective utility companies. I had long since stopped thinking of them as hiding places for contraband snowboards. They were just infrastructure now, unremarkable and unimportant. But sometimes, when I walked past the one where I had hidden my equipment during those tense days of malicious compliance, I would remember. I would think about how a single act of absurd pettiness, fining someone for winter gear in Colorado, had exposed corruption and led to systemic change. I would consider the chain of events that transformed a community from one ruled by fear to one built on principles of fairness and transparency. Life moved forward. I continued working from home, skiing on weekends, and serving on the HOA board with a commitment to preventing future abuses. Mr. Henderson and I maintained our friendship, often discussing neighborhood projects over beers. Deanna kept the finances meticulously organized and transparent. Nicole brought creativity and energy to community events. Together with dozens of other residents, we built something better than what Patricia had tried to impose. The house itself became truly mine in ways it had not been before. Without the constant threat of citations and fines, I could relax and enjoy my space. I painted the front door a deep blue color that I loved, properly approved through a streamlined process the new board had implemented. I installed a new mailbox that met standards but reflected my personal taste. I planted a garden in the spring with flowers that were beautiful rather than merely compliant with undefined community standards. These small freedoms mattered. They represented autonomy and dignity, the basic right to make decisions about your own property within reasonable boundaries. Patricia had tried to erase those boundaries, to extend HOA authority into every corner of residents' lives. She had failed, not because I was particularly brave or principled, but because she overreached so dramatically that even apathetic homeowners were motivated to act. By summer, the story of Pine Ridge Estates' HOA recall had spread beyond our community. Diana was invited to speak at a state HOA conference about governance reform and preventing fraud. Local news did a follow-up segment about successful community organizing. Several other neighborhoods in Colorado reached out asking for advice about their own problematic HOA boards. We shared everything we had learned. Document everything. Know your bylaws and state laws. Build coalitions with other affected homeowners. Follow proper procedures. Focus on facts and principles rather than personal attacks. Be willing to invest time and effort into creating change. And recognize when problems cross the line from disagreement into actual illegality. Patricia's prosecution became a case study in HOA fraud. The district attorney's office used it as an example in training materials for investigators. The judge who sentenced her made pointed comments about the importance of fiduciary duty and the betrayal of trust that occurs when elected leaders exploit their positions for personal gain. I attended the sentencing hearing, not out of vindictiveness, but because I felt I owed it to the community to see the process through. Patricia looked diminished, much smaller than she had seemed when she stood on my porch demanding I remove my snowboard from behind the utility box. She made a brief statement expressing remorse and acknowledging the harm she had caused. I do not know if she truly understood the impact of her actions or was simply following her attorney's advice, but it marked the definitive end of her influence over Pine Ridge Estates. Walking out of the courthouse that day, I felt relief more than satisfaction. Justice had been served, but more importantly, our community had been restored. The legal system had functioned as it should, holding someone accountable for criminal behavior regardless of how local or seemingly small scale the crimes might have appeared. The seasons continued their cycle. Another winter arrived, my second in Pine Ridge Estates and infinitely better than the first. My snowboard and skis remained in my garage, used regularly and stored without fear. The utility boxes stood in their various locations throughout the neighborhood, no longer symbols of resistance, but simply part of the infrastructure landscape. I had learned that home is more than just a building you own. It is about community, relationships, systems of governance that either enhance or diminish quality of life. It is about standing up when things are wrong, even when the issue seems trivial. It is about recognizing that small injustices, left unchallenged, can mask much larger problems. Pine Ridge Estates was now a place I was proud to call home. Not because it was perfect, but because when tested, the community had chosen justice over convenience, fairness over authority, and transparency over corruption. We had taken an HOA that existed primarily to generate revenue through petty enforcement and transformed it into what it should have been all along. An organization that served residents' genuine needs and protected our shared interests. The story could have ended differently. If fewer people had been willing to sign the petition, if Diana had not brought her legal expertise, if the evidence of fraud had not been so clear, Patricia might still be issuing citations and enriching herself at community expense. The fact that we succeeded was not inevitable. It required effort, courage, and commitment from dozens of people who decided that enough was enough. As I sit here now, writing this account more than a year after that first citation appeared on my garage door, I feel grateful for the unexpected journey. I never wanted to fight my HOA. I never wanted to organize recalls or attend endless meetings or become a board member myself. I just wanted to live peacefully in my house near the mountains. But sometimes life demands more from us. Sometimes the petty bureaucrat needs to be challenged. Sometimes the corrupt official needs to be exposed. Sometimes the broken system needs to be fixed, even when it requires time and energy you would rather spend elsewhere. My snowboard sits in my garage right now, covered in fresh wax and ready for tomorrow's trip to Loveland Pass. My skis hang on a wall mount I installed last month. My winter gear is organized but visible, arranged in a way that makes sense for my life rather than conforming to someone else's arbitrary aesthetic preferences. And that utility box down the street, the beige monstrosity that briefly served as my equipment cache during those days of malicious compliance. It is still there, still ugly, still unmaintained by whatever utility company owns it. But now when I walk past it, I smile. Not because I won some petty battle with an HOA president, but because that ridiculous hiding spot became the first step in a journey that genuinely improved my community. Patricia is in prison. The HOA functions properly. Property values have actually increased as word spread about our successful governance reforms. Neighbors know and support each other. And I can store my winter gear wherever the hell I want in my own garage. Sometimes the smallest acts of resistance lead to the biggest changes. Sometimes standing up over something as trivial as a snowboard behind a utility box can expose corruption, mobilize a community, and create lasting positive change. And sometimes the best revenge against petty bureaucratic tyranny is not anger or escalation, but simply refusing to accept injustice and working patiently through proper channels to create something better. That is the story of how my HOA fined me for visible winter gear, how I hid it behind their ugly utility boxes, and how that act of malicious compliance ultimately brought down a corrupt board president and transformed Pine Ridge Estates into a real community. It was exhausting. It was frustrating. It took far more time and effort than I ever anticipated, but it was absolutely worth it.